I was born and raised in Malaysia, and I played a lot of tennis, and I finally got like a tennis scholarship, right, to play tennis for a college here in the U.S. So I went to Gonzaga University over in Spokane, Washington, and I did my bachelor's in computer science there for 4 years, and then yeah, so after that I went to a startup, and then here I am at Twitter.
How important was that, getting that real world experience compared to just building projects by yourself?
I think at the time, right, like it like kind of preface this, it wasn't an intentional choice between do I go to FAANG or do I go to a startup or do I do my own thing. It was more of a situational thing where I didn't really get any offers from all the big FAANG companies. So I struggled a little bit and finally landed a job at the startup. And back to your question there in terms of how important it was to kind of learn the ropes, I think, like having this real world experience, I would say that it's very, very critical in terms of both a personal development perspective and also in terms of learning the ropes of how to develop software from someone that you admire, someone who's had a lot of industry experience. So I think in comparison between the two of them, right, if you were to compare working at a startup versus working on your own side projects, I would say that the environment that you get from working at a startup is that you're going to have a lot of other people who've had working experience either in a startup or in the big FAANG like tech company. They can kind of help guide you along and tell you and kind of teach you the ropes of how to write much better code. Whereas if you're working on a side project, you're going to be a little bit more hacky, and you're kind of like trying to kind of put things together using, like whatever that you can think of. And usually I think, because I've kind of dabbled in both of them, and I think like working on side projects on your own, it's a challenge for your own creativity, but also it doesn't really give you that much in terms of writing code that's maintainable, that's clean, that can scale for the long term.
Okay. And you were able to witness all that at the startup. That was a real world, just immersive experience with how real code works. Because I know with my audience, a lot of them are completely self-taught, and there's a huge difference between learning it and then actually developing it in the real world. It's just like a totally different world. So in terms of how you prepared for your FAANG interviews, I guess I have a two-part question to this. How did you prepare for your FAANG level interviews? And then how did it differ from your experience interviewing with a startup?
Yeah, so in terms of preparation for any of those big tech companies, I think at a high level, you have to practice a lot. So you have to pick one language, usually a language that you're very familiar with, like Python, Java, JavaScript, what have you. And then you want to make sure that you know all the basic data structures like arrays, your linked lists, your graphs, all the algorithms like depth first search, breadth first search, all of that good stuff from your computer science fundamentals. Because I think in my perspective, a lot of the bigger tech companies that have a lot more resources to train people, and they're not really looking for specialists in a particular area. So when they hire, they are kind of leaning a little bit more heavily towards computer science fundamentals, so making sure that you understand computer science basics much better. In comparison to interviewing at startups, I've seen in my own experience is that they a lot of times look for people who've already had skills or expertise in certain areas that they're looking for. Now, of course, that's not the general case, right? Now, not every startup operates that way because, like Airbnb is a startup, right? Like you can't say that, oh, they're just hiring for, an expert in like Scala or something like that. They're probably still very much similar to what like Google hires their engineers. But, in my own specific scenario, when I was interviewing at the startup, I didn't have any work experience and I didn't have any expertise in certain areas. But they did ask me, questions like, very, very basic fundamental computer science problems. And they were gauging much more on do I know how to write code? Am I able to learn and pick things up really quickly? So I think, like if I were to kind of summarize both of the approaches, I think if you're preparing for more like big tech companies, focus more on your computer science fundamentals. And if you're preparing for like a smaller startup, focus more on, like the hands-on experience, like demonstrating that you're able to pick things up really quickly, demonstrate that you're very open to learning and soak things up, because in a startup, everything can change. Sometimes like you might be using Python today and then you're using like Node.js tomorrow. So the ability to pick things up really quickly, be really like greedy to kind of show that grit, I think it's much more important.
Okay, great answer. And so to kind of piggyback on that, ultimately you received offers from Microsoft, Amazon, and Twitter. And you had just explained now that, your computer science fundamentals are so important when you're interviewing with these big tech companies. Do you think that is the core of getting a job with them? What do you attribute to getting these offers? Was it your solid foundation of computer science, or was it additional factors as well?
I think it's definitely like a combination of multiple factors. And one of the factors is definitely not my own like ability to write great code. I think like I'm a very, very average software engineer, right? I'm able to write code to get something done, right? But I'm not, what you would call like a rock star engineer. So I think what really made a difference there in terms of like how I was able to get those offers was, number one, I think socializing was very, very important. So like with my interview at Microsoft, the hiring team there was actually a referral from my ex manager, right, for a startup, for the startup that I was working at. So my former manager like sort of had that working relationship with the Microsoft team over there, and then they were just kind of happening to like hire someone for their team. So I think that definitely helped a lot in terms of building that connection and kind of making that relationship a little bit. I won't say that it was easier to get in as a result, but it definitely helped that I was able to kind of build that connection up front. And I think that definitely helped me in the interviewing process. That was like the number one thing. For Amazon, I've interviewed with them multiple times in the past, and I didn't end up going to Amazon earlier on. So again, that's kind of like back to the relationship there. I've kind of had this ongoing relationship with the hiring manager there. I didn't end up joining Amazon because I had chosen to kind of stay on at the startup earlier. And when it came time to kind of look for a new opportunity, I just kind of reached out to him, and he said like, yeah, come interview for us. And aside from that, I think also like, like if I were to summarize everything, it's one, having strong connections, building relationship with people, not just like people that you think would benefit you in the future, but in general, just like find people out there, socialize, communicate with them, and see if maybe there's a mutually beneficial relationship that comes out of it. Right? That's the first part. I think the second thing here also is that from an individual perspective, if you're working in a startup or what have you, the most important thing there is to absorb as much as you can and learn as much as you can. Because at the end of the day, when a company interviews you, they're not looking at just what you have done necessarily, but also how you have gone around achieving those goals, right? So you want to demonstrate that you're able to learn things really quickly, soak things up, and then run with the system, or like run with the process. So I think probably like those are some of the key things I would say are most important.
In your Medium article, you kind of broke down each interview experience, and they're not the big tech companies, we kind of lump them all together as interviewing a certain way and using a certain style. But you had mentioned some of your interviews you did not like, and some of these companies are just like, I don't think so. Do you think it's a difference between the interviewer, or is it more the entire company culture that was turning you off, or what were some elements that kind of turned you off or tuned you into some companies?
I think it's a combination of multiple things. Like you said, right? It could be a individual basis, or it could be a company interviewing basis as well. Some of the companies that I mentioned in the article, I think I just had like a really bad day with some of the interviewers. Like we were just not really clicking, and it just wasn't like the right thing. I couldn't really feel them. Like it was really hard to communicate. I felt that I was being disrespected in some cases there as well. So I don't think that reflects on the company overall. I think that reflects just on like the interviewer themselves. Um, the other thing I would kind of call out here, though, is that some companies that I won't name what the company was, but I did tell them after the fact that, hey, this is what your interviewer did. I think you should kind of look into that. I didn't get any responses after that. So the overall situation was that like I was interviewing, and then it was a system design question. So while I was trying to kind of attempt to figure out how to solve the problem, the interviewer was taking a nap. Yeah, I was looking at the whiteboard and I was like, drawing things out. I'm trying to like brainstorm on the whiteboard. And I turned around and he was taking a nap right there. And I just kept quiet for almost like 5 minutes. I was just like standing there. I was like gonna see how the interviewer is gonna respond. And like nothing happened. It was just like taking a nap right there.
Wow.
Yeah, so I thought that was something that needs to be called out. And
Right.
I sent that feedback to the company, never heard back from them. So I think that reflects on maybe not necessarily as the company culture, but I think it reflects on the HR and specifically like maybe the individual interviewer themselves.
You're getting these offers, but you ultimately went with Twitter. Why did you choose them in the end?
So I really had a great time chatting with the people throughout the entire interviewing process. It's one of those times when you go through an interview, this is what I tell a lot of people as well. Usually interviews are not just a one-way conversation, right? It's not them asking you questions all the time, but it's also you trying to gauge whether it's going to be a good fit. If you're able to have and hold those intellectual conversations with people, like the interviewers, and talk about something that's really meaningful to you, or talk about some interesting technical challenge, I think that reflects really well. It tells you that, okay, these are the people that you're potentially going to work with. Are you impressed by these people? Do you think that you're going to learn a lot from these people? Right. So throughout my interviewing process with Twitter, I felt that genuinely people there care about their work. They care about the people that they work with, and they're genuinely very, very smart. So the way that I define smart, and everyone kind of defines this kind of differently, and my way of figuring out what smart is that are they able to take a different domain where they're not really comfortable talking about. So for example, if you're a front-end engineer and I'm talking about something like about ads, like how to serve ads, and you might not have a lot of domain experience in this ads serving space, but you're able to kind of use first principles, figure out what are the challenges, how can you solve them, and kind of talk about, okay, what are some potential solutions to those problems. And I definitely felt that throughout the conversation with them, they're able to challenge me and also allow me to challenge them and ask them questions about what are the big problems within the teams and how they're trying to solve them, and where do they think I'm going to come in and have a lot of impact. So they're able to give me those answers, and I felt those are really good answers. So that's why I thought Twitter was the right company for me.
You had mentioned multiple times the importance, just critical importance of communication and networking skills. A lot of developers aren't natural extroverts, or they have, they're just shy people. Can you give some tips or techniques for people who are shy so they can start communicating better?
That's a great question. I have several things that I tell people that I kind of mentor right now. And one of those things is that during an interviewing setting, one of the often misunderstood tip is that you want to talk out loud all the time. And for someone like me, I'm not an extrovert either. I like to kind of have my own space and think about a problem, and then once I'm ready, kind of talk a little bit more about that. So I think what I always tell people is that it's perfectly fine to tell the interviewer and say like, hey, I'm going to pause for 5 minutes, 5 or 10 or however much time that you need. Let me think about this problem for a little bit, rather than just trying to throw everything that you can think of at the interviewer at that moment in time, right? Because for me, I need time to collect my thoughts to process everything and then formulate a solution or a plan. So that's what works for me. And I think when I've shared that advice with a lot of people, I think they've kind of resonated there as well. And it's been working well for them. So I think that's like the number one thing. Don't feel that you have to conform to this whole idea that you want to talk out loud all the time. It's perfectly fine. Take 5 minutes to formulate your thoughts. That's the number one thing. The second thing there is that try to empathize or try to build a shared understanding with what the interviewer is asking or what they're looking for. More concretely, what that means is that from a tactical perspective is asking them, does that make sense? Or do you want me to elaborate more about certain things? And asking them, do you want me to continue in this direction? Or do you want me to talk about something else? I've seen this happen for different kinds of candidates. One where they might keep talking and talking and talking without really checking whether or not the interviewer is still with them or understand where they're going. In which case, that's not a great idea. And the other one also is that they don't talk enough. So when an interviewer asks them like, okay, how would you build this? They would say like, oh, I'm going to use like Node.js. I'm going to use this framework. And then they stop there, right? So they're very passive in those regards. For people in that bucket of being much more passive and waiting for someone to kind of poke them and probe in certain areas, I think you have to kind of build this empathy and try to kind of think that if you were explaining this design to a junior engineer, right? Take it from the perspective of this interviewer right now is trying to learn something from you. They're the junior engineer in the room. How does that change your frame? Like, how does that change the thought process, right? I think for a lot of people, for me at least, that flips the table over and allows me to kind of be much more assertive. It helps me build the confidence to explain my thought process and how I'm thinking about problems. And also in general helps me be much more, how do I say it? Like, it helps me drive the conversation a lot better. I think for people who are looking for a job right now or struggling to land an interview, I think it's unfortunate that because like this whole COVID-19 that's happening, but if you're kind of struggling right now and you're not really sure what to do and you feel that your resume is not impressive enough or the work that you're doing is not impressive enough, what I recommend doing there is that doing some sort of action or taking some sort of action is much more important than figuring out what direction you want to go. What I mean specifically there is that I've heard some questions from people, people who reached out to me after my article and say like, hey, do you think I should spend time on side projects, or do you think I should spend time on my resume? Do you think I should spend more time at work? All these different kinds of questions. I think in general, whichever direction that you take is generally fine. I think taking action is much more important than picking the right direction to go. Because in my own personal experience, whenever I've kind of felt confused or stuck in a limbo where I'm not sure where to go, I just generally pick one direction and I'm just kind of biased for action here, right? I just pick one direction, go along with it, and then course correct as I go. So if you're a student or someone who's like looking for an internship or looking for a job, and you're not sure whether you should focus more on side projects or a resume, it doesn't really matter. Just pick one direction. Let's say you want to work on a side project, right? Just work on a side project, but make sure that you have a time box, right? You set a set time, like a box of time where you're going to work on that. And let's say you work for 2 weeks on your side projects, right? That's time limit for yourself. After the 2 weeks are up, you evaluate and see where you're at and what else you need to do in order to get to a state where you feel better about yourself, right? So what that does is that, number one, it makes sure that you're doing some action to improve or get yourself to a better state. And number two, having that time box, it makes sure that you're holding yourself accountable and you have a process in which you're able to do something, get some input, get some feedback for yourself, and then make a decision on how to course correct later on. So I think once you have that process in place, it's going to serve you pretty well in whatever area that you're looking. Like either that's for job interviews, either for figuring out whether you want to work on a side project or build a startup or start interviewing for a large tech company, like whatever that is. Once you have this process in place, I think it's going to help you find the direction that you eventually want to go.